Alright, so you know when you're like making mac and cheese, right? And you got the mac and cheese, you got the cheese sauce, you know what I'm saying? Like the butter, the flour, the milk, you know? And you got the noodles, you add the noodles, you mix them in a little bit, and then you're ready to bake it. You're ready to bake it. And like you put it in like the pan, you like spread it out, you flatten it out, and then you sprinkle some cheese on top. You can't just bake it like that. You gotta sprinkle some cheese, and you add a little bit of paprika. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what you gotta do to get the good mac and cheese. And like stir fries are the same way. Like you make a stir fry, right? You get the vegetables, you get the meat, you fry it up in like the wok or whatever, and then you add some salt, and then you taste it, and you're like, it's not enough flavor. So, but what you don't do is just add more salt. You instead add different seasonings, like oyster sauce. You know, like you add like pepper, like the Barbera, or like Worcestershire sauce. Like, you feel me? You get it? So like that's what you gotta do. Like you gotta add different stuff. And games are actually the same way. Like let's say you got a sword attack, or like a pea shooter, basic shoot attack. You don't just add more of that. You gotta add the cool stuff, the infernal beams, the surfing, kickflip, spear attacks from whatever Ori is, the time stops. You feel me? Like, that's what you gotta add. That's like heavy attack spells in games are like some of the coolest concepts, in my opinion, consistently. And they lead to like some of the hypest and also the most tactical sequences. They just add so much to a game. So let's talk about them.
Of course, heavy attacks being heavy attacks implies somehow they're different from their lighter counterparts, and that difference is of course their well thought out limitations. Sometimes the limit is baked into the attack animation itself. For example, in the Smash game, Smash attacks have what's called a follow-through animation. It's the animation that plays after the primary action has occurred and vastly reduces the player's movement options whilst the animation plays. This style of limit is really good for games where positioning is important. Wind-up animations can also be added. Some games also employs cooldown system. Shorter cooldowns force a variety of attacks like in Wizard of Legend, while longer cooldowns force you to play around your coolest abilities rather than just with your coolest abilities. And we'll lump in cooldowns with stuff that just, you have to deal a certain amount of damage or take a certain amount of damage. And of course then there's mana, which is the last limit I'll talk about. Usually it's some sort of limiting quality. You can call mana, magic, anything really. I think it's called Rage in Mortal Kombat, the Rage meter. Anyways, you can get mana from taking damage, dealing damage, or you also get it from just being on the field. This is like specifically a resource that can be used for multiple things. While this might seem like a lot to remember, we can divide these limits into two major categories based on the function from a game design perspective. Those categories being limitations on cowardice or string incentivizing limits, or limitations on recklessness or setup incentivizing limits. Firstly, let's discuss string limits. String limit types reward a string of attacks, which basically means you can use your heavy attacks as long as you're beating the crap out of someone. In a game like Wizard of Legends, the spell cooldown is usually around 3 to 6 seconds, forcing players to build a deck of arcana around combos they want to achieve. The cooldown is short enough to never leave the player high and dry, while it's being long enough that they're forced to use multiple spells, and think about which spells they decide to use. But the amazing thing is that the game itself is designed around this limitation of its heavy attacks. Both the player and enemies become stunned for a substantial amount of time when hit, meaning they can't retaliate, which means all offense, assuming you hit all possible threats, for the player has literally zero downsides, which is in contrast to most other games which usually don't allow the player to pummel opponents so easily, leading to a very characteristic gameplay that's both extremely challenging and also fair. Crosscode is also a really good example of a game with heavy attacks and string type limitation implementation. It's a tongue twister. In Crosscode, heavy attacks are called martial arts, and these martial arts require MP, which is gained through dealing damage to enemies. The result is very combo focused gameplay which has you string together moves with a complex web of basic attacks, martial arts, and elements of switching.
Though it should be noted that unlike Wizard of Legend, Crosscode's hit stun is fairly moderate. Because of this, the player is given a lot of different options to compensate. For example, they have their basic slash attack and some range attacks. And they also have plenty of defensive options with their shield and shield martial arts, along with hit and run tactics with dash martial arts.
Other than string styles, there's also another limitation type, which is setup limitation. These styles include more extreme versions of string limits like longer cooldowns or maybe more damage has to be done before you can use an attack. But it can also be a limitation baked into the moves themselves, like situational attacks for example. The Risk of Rain franchise is a really good example of a setup type heavy attacks. The cooldowns on the smash attacks themselves make them unreliable source of damage. My bad, brother. The cooldowns on the attacks themselves make them an unreliable source of damage, and such you'll be using your primary attack the vast majority of the game. But with clever planning, you can actually maximize your abilities when they're off their cooldown. For example, the Railgunner is the resident sniper of the roster, so Railgunner gets the Crowbar item in multiplayer game, an item which increases damage dealt to targets over 90% health. Railgunner should shoot the boss first with her ultimate. Railgunner can't just spam her most powerful attacks, but she can instead plan around the limitation disallowing continuous use for, more unique scenarios. Other characters are designed similarly too, like Commando has this secondary ability that allows him to shoot like a piercing shot. So obviously you want to line up the enemies before you shoot it. You can't just spam it, but when you do get it, obviously try to hit multiple enemies. A character like Artificer actually has a cooldown on her primary as well as their other abilities, which doesn't result in her going ham like in Wizard of Legend because it's a setup type game, not a string type game. Instead, it has her keeping her distance and tactically, shooting enemies from afar. Basically, setting up her shots, which is why I called it that, setup. Of course, not all games have to adhere to just one limitation type. If you recognize all the games I've mentioned, you probably figured out I'm a huge roguelite fan, and roguelites offer a player a lot of build diversity because they have to be played over and over again. And with this emphasis on build diversity and just replayability within the genre, it can lead to some games within the roguelite genre just choosing both heavy attack types. So remember when I said Risk of Rain franchise had setup limits? Well, that's only if you don't spec into backup mags or power cells, and Wizard of Legend is arguably a setup type as well, because you can spec into charge attacks. But a game that goes all out, all the way string and all the way setup is Hades, or more specifically Hades 2. It's like a roguelike visual novel. It's not a dating sim. That'd be weird. Okay, that would be weird.
As long as it's agreeable for you.
It is. Agreeable, it is.
That would be weird. But anyway, it's a really good game. You should definitely play it. I played it way too much. Instead of making a video, I was just like, bro, I'm just gonna make a video about it. Productivity, yes. Anyways, all you gotta really think about with Hades 2 is that there's different spells between the weapons, and you can spec into either normal attacks or magic attacks, throughout your run. If you use a weapon like the Moonstone Axe, which is like a really slow attacking weapon, and get boons from like Apollo or Hera for maximum damage, and focus on spell speed upgrades from like the Daedalus hammers you get, and mana, you can actually have a spell spam build, which overcomes the mana requirement for, charged up attacks. But if you use a weapon like the Sister Blades and spec into attack damage with boons like Aphrodite or Zeus, you can actually, your mana pools probably won't be as good because you'll be using mostly normal attacks, which means it's kind of like a setup type game with its heavy attacks. So yeah, what's it called? Now there's two things I failed to mention. There's occasional items, which you can use occasionally. This is like what Enter the Gungeon does for most of its items. And there's also ammunition for heavy attacks. Like heavy attacks might have like a set amount of uses, but I didn't mention those because that's more resource management than like spells, which is what I was going for this video. And yeah, remember kids, roguelike good, AAA bad.
Oh, there's a boss.
Oh, there's a. What is that?
Hey man, whatever it is, it can die.
Yeah, I agree actually.